You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This month we are chatting with Carmina, who is a goth fashion journalist who started blogging back in 2007, sharing her experiences with alternative art and culture around the world. She's hosted and appeared on a number of shows for the Travel Channel, the Food Network, National Geographic, CNN, and others. She's published multiple books, with her newest being titled The Little Book of Satanism, which is set to be released later this year. On this episode, though, we'll be chatting about goth in Japan, sharing tips and tricks for planning your next trip out of the country. We'll also be discussing our experiences with the Satanic Panic and discussing some topics around Satanism in places outside of North America. We've also got our album review, some extended conversations around a whole slew of goth bands, and more to get to. So as always, I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Carmina, thank you so much for being on the show with us today. I'd like to start by asking a bit about your history. If you can tell us when you were first introduced to goth and maybe a bit about how that impacted you and why that has stayed with you over time, that would be lovely.
Well, I grew up in Vancouver, Canada, and I think a lot of people who now identify as goth have a similar journey where they were always drawn to things like Halloween and horror movies as kids. I always enjoyed the things that people thought were a little darker. And I didn't shy away from things like horror movies and the scarier aspects of life that my childhood peers would find frightening and wouldn't want to be interested in. So yeah, I kind of always had that sort of orientation. Then when I was a teen, I really started getting into goth subculture. I loved going to used CD and cassette stores and discovering all these bands from the 80s, like The Cure and Bauhaus and all of them. And so that was sort of my introduction to goth music, since this isn't something that you could easily hear on the radio or see in music videos on TV. It was really through exploring the secondhand stores. And I always loved fashion as well. That's something I gravitated to since I was a kid as well. So I would love to experiment with gothic fashion, especially in my teen years, wearing things that I would scout in vintage stores or on my family trips to Hong Kong and Japan. That's where I really got fascinated by the flamboyant and experimental gothic clothing I saw there. Then also going to concerts as a teen. When you're underage, you can't really go to the clubs yet, but I would see shows that, I guess you would call them goth bands or goth adjacent, like Birthday Massacre and Perfect Circle, bands like that as a teen.
Yeah.
And then growing a little older, exploring the gothic clubs once I could sneak in or get in. I lived in New York for a while when I was in school, so I'd go to the Pyramid Club and check out the goth scene there. And it just grew. It was always my world. I felt close to the people in that scene. I just connected with friends who enjoyed the same things, who wanted to check out the concerts and the clubs with me, go to festivals. And that's sort of how it all began.
Birthday Massacre, I think that first album came out around the time I was a mall goth, and that sound from that album like blew my mind at the time. I had that album on repeat for so long. It was so good. But on the other side of introductions then, where did your sort of journey, I guess, or love of traveling develop, and why or how or when did that become a fashion blog and sort of start developing into becoming a subject matter expert on that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I feel like everything always kind of happens organically and fits in with the things that you've always loved throughout childhood and through your early years. So I was really lucky because I traveled a lot in my childhood because my family is from Hong Kong originally. So we would often travel to Asia and we'd stay with family and spend, a month in Hong Kong and hop around a bit to Japan and other places in Asia. So from the beginning, I was exposed to travel and loved exploring a different culture and different world from North America. Especially back then in the 90s, this is before the internet had everything on there. So you couldn't get the clothes, you couldn't buy them online, you couldn't see the subculture and the way the fashion was unless you actually went there. And so I found that fascinating. I loved seeing the style tribes in Harajuku and just, investigating the subcultures wherever I went, even when I was a teenager. So even before I started the blog, this is something that I gravitated towards. And I think a lot of your listeners would feel the same. Like if you're going to London, you'd want to check out Slimelight or Camden or go to Highgate Cemetery. It's just something I naturally wanted to do. But starting the blog, that was in 2007. So very early in blog years. I just started La Carmina blog as a hobby. Back then, blogging wasn't a career, so I didn't think it would lead to anything. But I just wanted to share the things I loved. And back then, you didn't have much information online about the Japanese goth scene and the music scene and fashion. So it was my way of sharing it and connecting with people who love the same things. And it all grew from there into what I do now.
It is really lovely to hear that, though, because the blogs and like live journals and all that kind of thing were really a lifeline for a lot of people. Because that was the internet in a lot of ways and how people found out about fashion and music and all that kind of thing. So to see that you were able to put yourself and your passion out there and really develop that into what you do is like super, super cool. Speaking of Japan, I know you talked about in other places, Japan being one of your favorite places to visit. And, I have your book about theme restaurants in Tokyo, which has a lot of really, really cool information in there and is really fun to read through. I wanted to ask you a few questions about Japan specifically, because that's come up as a topic just randomly in the last month or two in a couple places in my own life. And so I thought you would be an interesting person to ask about that. And the first question kind of came up in this panel discussion that Trey and I were part of for a Dutch museum that was talking about goth and the Gothic. And other members of that panel mentioned a couple times that Japan has had an influence on goth through its interpreting of Eurocentric goth music and fashion into something new, and then feeding that culturally back to North America, essentially. And that's kind of generally how people talk about that sort of relationship. But I wanted to ask what your perspective on that was, and then maybe more broadly, what goth looks like in Japan from your experience.
Sure. Yeah, that's a fascinating topic. And I think it's not so simplistic as one absorbing and transforming. I think there's a lot of back and forth and conversation. And sometimes these trends or these ideas influence each other without knowing the direct A to B line. For instance, I'm thinking in the 80s, I was too young for this, but talking to my friends in Japan that were part of the goth scene in the 80s, it was already happening. And it sounds like it was as vibrant as the goth scene in London and in New York at the time. So developing after, but still by the 80s, there was something vibrant there. And even when I was there in the early mid 2000s, you would see people doing the death rock styles. I have some great photos from back in the day on my site. People with the white makeup and the sky high hair. And they're genuine. It's not just surface. I think sometimes people write off Japanese goth or fashion as just aesthetic, but the people I know, they're DJs, they own the vinyls, they love the music, they've gone to the festivals in Europe, they're really passionate about goth culture, even though they do their own spin on it. That certainly, there's definitely a Japanese twist on it, and it has its own unique elements for sure. I think visually, aesthetics are a huge part of the Japanese goth scene, and they're different from the fashions and makeups that you'll see in Western clubs. Often it's more elegant. Often you see the Victorian or Lolita-inspired elements. And we can talk about that later, how that feeds into each other. So I think there aren't any strict lines necessarily about where the subculture begins and ends or what informs one another. I just think it's fascinating, and it's certainly very vibrant and unique in Japan.
No, I think you make a really good point too, actually, about that being present in the 80s. And from my end, like most of the music I know that's Japanese goth are bands from the early to mid 80s. I don't think I know many, if any, modern bands. But to that point, I think it's worth just mentioning that the way that we kind of think about goth as a strictly European phenomenon, and sometimes American bands being foundational, is not necessarily the case. And maybe part of that is just a language barrier, where in North America we just don't have access to understanding what was going on, because it's a whole different part of the internet that we don't understand maybe. But I think we need to kind of change the way we view the evolution and the roots of goth culture in some ways.
Yeah, certainly. I think also back then, without the internet, everything was really self-contained. How would you get a goth band's cassette that they produced, maybe 100 of them, and sold it from some little store in Harajuku? How would you get that, right, in America? So, and there would be tons of bands that have come and gone, and you would have never heard their names, but they certainly were there and creating and adding to the subculture.
Yeah. And just to throw out for anyone interested, there's the few bands I know, there's 13th Moon, which is I think probably the most well-known like death rock goth band.
That's it, yeah.
Phadia, Asylum, and then one that I really like is Automod, which is not a death rock band. They're more like post-punk, but they have saxophones, which means they're automatically a better band than everyone else. So you should go check them out if you haven't heard them already.
Yeah, they're so good live, all the bands that you mentioned, and they're so friendly and welcoming. And even if you don't know Japanese, it just doesn't matter, because people connect. You can tell people have the shared interests and outlook, and you're automatically connecting when you meet.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think, one of the common themes I've heard from people that I've talked to whenever traveling comes up, and going to festivals in other countries and that kind of thing, is even if you don't speak the language necessarily, that you're going to have this shared bond, and you're going to be welcomed, and you're going to have a good time and be able to still find your tribe and all that kind of thing. So that's lovely to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've definitely found that to be true. Is if you're traveling, even if you don't speak the language, as long as you're not being obnoxious about it, and being the sort of stereotypical American or obnoxious English speaker, and just yelling at people and expecting them to all kowtow to your language needs, you're going to find welcome. You're going to find people who appreciate you. You're going to find good relationships pretty much anywhere you go, because people are generally curious about others, just as long as they're not feeling like they're being put upon or mocked or looked down upon.
Yeah. 100%.
You did mention Gothic Lolita, and I wanted to briefly ask you about this, because that was something that kind of made me cringe. One of the panelists, regarding the same sort of thing that Trey and I were on, one of the panelists said, when the subject of sort of goth fashion substyles and different ways of being goth came up, the stereotype or trope, or however you want to call it, of using Gothic Lolita as one of the types of goth was invoked by one of the panelists. So I wanted to just throw that to you as a question of, or that statement, is what is Gothic, not what is Gothic Lolita, but how is that viewed? Is that part of goth?
Right. I agree with you. I wouldn't view it as a subcategory. I think if you look at the evolution of it, it's more from inspired by Alice in Wonderland, cuteness, aesthetics, Victorian and Rococo fashion. And it was really put forward by Malice Miser, the band. They have the fashion line Moi Même Moitié, and a lot of the shops in Harajuku kind of came out in the 80s, and they really had the style tribes showing up on the bridge, the Harajuku Bridge, and forming a fashion subculture. But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of overlap and fluidity, and I'm not one for having strict boundaries. For instance, I personally know people who go to the goth nights, and they're people who love goth music, and they're very much part of the subculture, and they love to dress in Gothic Lolita sometimes, or maybe most of the time. So I wouldn't say it's always so clear cut, but I agree with you that if you're looking at the evolution or the roots of Gothic Lolita, I wouldn't say that comes from goth in the sense of the music from the early 80s and whatnot. And they have their own unique subculture too that isn't necessarily goth subculture. For instance, there's the tea parties that are reminiscent of the Mad Hatter's tea parties, or vendors where they might gather and sell these beautiful handmade corsets and bonnets and whatnot. So definitely a subculture and a style tribe of its own that's genuine and fascinating.
Yeah, I a lot of times just think of it as more of it's a subculture that came out of the literary and the arts term Gothic rather than the musical subculture. But because goth also takes a lot of inspiration from that, there's some shared interests, some shared overlap, and so there's definitely some interactions between Gothic Lolita subculture and goth subculture. And then the fact that we've hammered many times on this show that nobody is just one thing. If you're an individual, you're not just a goth or just a Gothic Lolita or just a whatever. You can be a goth and also happen to like Gothic Lolita, maybe dress like that. You don't need to make Gothic Lolita goth to feel okay about it. You can be kind of both. It's allowed, but it doesn't mean you have to conflate the two and make Gothic Lolita somehow a subset of goth or one of the many aesthetic choices within the goth fashion idiom.
Yeah, I think that's a closed-minded way of thinking, and I prefer to take a broader perspective. And I also should mention that within Lolita, there's other elements of Lolita that aren't goth at all. There's sweet Lolita that's all pink, pastel, and Guro, which is very bloody. So there's different types of Lolita that aren't at all goth.
Yeah, we discussed a lot in a previous episode. We had someone who was actually into Gothic Lolita, and we had a whole episode. What was that last? Was that?
It was a couple years ago, I think. Now
it doesn't feel like it was that long ago, but years don't mean anything anymore.
Speaking of things that are fluid, time is also.
But yeah, that was definitely a really interesting episode.
So one more question in this sort of train of thought, something that I was curious about. In thinking about this, is that when you think about Western subcultures broadly, goth specifically, most people agree that these subcultures originate in some form of music and then branch off into fashion and other ephemera from there. Now, obviously, there are debates around online. Do you need to listen to music to be goth, et cetera, et cetera? I think that's generally a niche internet debate rather than a common practice. But that aside, I think it's generally accepted. These are music subcultures. Looking at Japan, as an outsider, it seems to be known for these extravagant street style subcultures, which appear to take a different approach and maybe bypass music. So I wanted to ask how Japanese street styles maybe compare and contrast to Western subcultures in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate observation. I think if you look at goth, if you look at punk, if you look at, say, rave, it's stemming from the music. And in Japan, it's a bit, there are other influences. You mentioned literary art influences, and I certainly see that along with music. There are so many style tribes at this point, starting from, say, the 70s to now, and they keep evolving, and you always have new niches and sub-niches. But just to give a few as examples, there's Fairy K, which is kind of a 1980s inspired pastel pop culture look. And so that you can tie more to 1980s color palettes and cartoons and whatnot, but also to the pop music of the time. And then you might have some, there's Dolly K, there's forest, like morike. So it's sometimes there's kimono styles that they're fascinating. You see punk meets cyber meets kimono. So I think, yeah, you're right that it's not necessarily just grounded in music, and you don't see that direct connections a lot of the time. But I would say they pull from a variety of influences: art, literature, pop culture, and also music, as in the visual kei styles or even hip hop Japanese styles. So it's not necessarily either or, but certainly fashion is perhaps music is perhaps not the main element in these subcultures.
Right. Very cool. Interesting. So, all right.
I just had one quick question. I don't know if, look at me, if you're familiar or if you ever saw, there was a BBC documentary series several years ago called Japanorama. Familiar with that at all?
I didn't see it, but I think I've heard of it.
Okay. That was probably one of my first introductions to the variety of Japanese culture. I was kind of curious if you'd seen it because I was wanting to get, the opinion of someone who's been more immersed in it, of whether it was I guess an honest portrayal of Japanese subculture, or yet another of the trope of, Western audiences just looking at all the quote unquote weird stuff and just sort of jumping down the rabbit hole of, oh, those crazy Japanese with their weird commercials and their weird street styles and all this stuff. It didn't feel like it was too disingenuous about that. It felt like it had some honest curiosity, but I'm always a little bit leery of that when it's so clearly from a Western perspective.
Yeah, it's a hard line because you do want to show the creativity and vibrancy without othering it and without making it seem like this eccentric other. And I haven't seen that particular one, although I've heard of it. But as you might know, I do work in TV, and my business partner and I, we help TV shows film in Japan, and often they want to cover subcultures. So to us, it's really important that things are portrayed fairly. They're not sensationalizing or glossing over important elements of the subculture. If they are, for instance, filming at a fetish party like Department H, it's not just about, oh, look at these weird, bizarre things. Let's see where the participants are coming from and who they really are and what's inspiring them. So I think that's always a really important perspective to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Humanizing rather than, othering, like you said. Yeah, for sure. Well, speaking of working in TV and speaking about travel and on TV and doing interviews all over the internet, as far as this podcast is concerned, we haven't really talked about travel in general. It's a pretty novel concept, largely because I have no experience in that department. And so I wouldn't speak to that, which is why I'm excited to have you here to utilize your expertise. So at the risk of boring you with questions you've answered dozens of times, I'd like to just ask a few quick questions around travel specifically.
Please go ahead. It's my favorite topic, so I never get bored of talking about that.
I know you said this was part of your childhood and part of your life, so maybe it wasn't sort of a sea change or a large shift in your worldview, but maybe over time, how has traveling changed the way that you view yourself and the world?
Yeah, enormously. And as I mentioned, I started traveling even when I was a baby, but that was with family, to see family in Asia. But we always traveled quite a fair amount, even in the US, and taking a trip to Europe during my childhood. So I feel really lucky I got to do that. And then when I went to school, I lived in the States, and I would sometimes do short trips to see friends. Then a lot of my work brought me to Japan, especially after I started my La Carmina blog. So the writing and the TV brought me frequently to Japan. And from there, I started getting more and more offers to do travel writing and travel projects, such as with tourism boards or with hotels and whatnot. And I took full advantage of every opportunity to go somewhere new. So again, feeling really lucky I got the chance to visit so many places through these partnerships. And at this point, I've been to over 70 countries. But I think that the main lesson is the more you travel, the less you hold on to views of who you are and how things should be. I think travel by default, there's always instability and surprises. Things are never how you expect. You're going to be jet lagged. Things are going to go wrong with transportation. You're going to discover some food that surprises you in either good or bad ways. You're going to meet people that you never expected would transform your way of thinking, just because the way they walk through life is so different. And some of these people I met that I can think of were people within subcultures. I loved meeting people in the punk scene in Myanmar, of all places. It's a very fascinating combination of Buddhism and punk. So something like that can only exist there. I've met people who identify as the third gender, Hijra, in India. Yeah. I've met drag queens all around the world, including in the Middle East, where it's something that's quite difficult for expression. So I just meet people that it's always about the people, seeing their courage, seeing how they're just always so friendly and wonderful, even if their lives are completely different from yours. And it frees you. I think we get bogged down in our everyday worries. We go through the same patterns and thoughts and anxieties. But the moment you step into another place, you're grappling with different things. You don't know the language. You can't figure out the subway. You're trying to figure out where to go. And then you go there and you're just completely taken aback because it's completely different from what you see in a photo or video. So to me, that's the transformative aspect of travel.
Yeah, I definitely have experienced that as well. Anytime that I've traveled places, it's fascinating to see places. And one thing that I love is just when I travel, I like to get lost. Just go and just sort of wander. I'll usually have maps. I mean, that's easy now with phones, but even before we had phones, I would always come with, various maps, a way to find my way back if need be. But I would purposely just sort of let my feet take me somewhere and just explore that way. And I found that's one of the most interesting ways to find hidden areas, to find the real place, rather than, a lot of times, especially Americans and, well, really a lot of English speaking folks, well, who knows, maybe it's all people who travel who are just sort of the generic travelers, go to the sort of comfortable enclaves, the places where all the tourists go, and it's been designed to be welcoming to foreigners. It's got the menus and signs in all the different languages, and it's just got the number of tourists there compared to the number of people who live in the actual area is so weighted towards the tourists that sometimes it doesn't even feel like you're visiting somewhere else, other than maybe some kitschy architecture that says, hey, look at me, I'm whatever, Dutch or Indian, or Mexican architecture, but it's very obviously consciously put there to evoke that in a foreign audience. But just sort of wandering off the beaten path, with your eyes open, of course. You don't want to do that completely blindly, but doing so with your wits about you and your eyes open, it's usually perfectly safe, and it's the best way to really get a feel for what it's like in that world for people who really live there. And I've always found that to be fascinating.
Well, so on the other end of that, then, for someone I haven't traveled out of the country yet. My wife and I are planning to do that hopefully this year.
Wonderful.
But with that, because we haven't yet, there's some anxiety around that. So do you have any advice for sort of tackling how to approach that for the first time, and maybe have a good idea, maybe a plan of attack or some tips around lowering anxiety and fear of doing something that's completely unknown like that?
Yeah, sure. I think first, it's a lot easier now with things being online, resources, even maps. I just remember back then having this paper map I could barely decipher and getting lost all the time. But as Trey was mentioning, but then now you have Google Maps, you have the internet. I think it's a lot easier to find information online as well. Can I ask specifically, what are some of the anxieties? Because my advice might depend on that.
Well, mine specifically are generally around flying. And then if we were to go, like, one of the places we're thinking about is Germany, which I know has a lot of English speaking conveniences. But if we were to go somewhere that wasn't primarily English speaking, like maybe a smaller town in Germany, just sort of navigating, getting around, public transportation, that kind of thing, things that we don't really have here, so that we don't know how to use because American transportation sucks, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I like to do a mix of planning and flexibility and seeing where things go, because I think it's good to have some structure. For instance, I like to have my flights booked if there's trains, especially these days with COVID and things being online and unpredictable. It's good to have things booked in advance, such as your trains, because if you go last minute, they might be booked out or more expensive, or it might be more of a hassle. So if you generally know, okay, I want to be in Berlin for these days and take the train around this day, I would book those in advance along with accommodations rather than scrambling at the last minute. And I also think, I like to make a Google Doc to share with whoever I'm traveling with. We'll write down the confirmation numbers, phone numbers, we'll put copies of the flights. So it's all there in one document. And to me, that's really helpful, because if there's something that we're looking for at the last minute or we can't figure out, just open the Google Doc and it should be there. I think also sometimes people don't realize you can't visit certain castles or historic attractions or go to concerts last minute. These days, they must be booked in advance because of time slots and COVID. So if there's something you really want to go to, even if it's a museum on a certain day, book it in advance. That's my advice, so that you don't miss out on it. Because if you just show up, chances are you won't be able to go, and you're only there for so long.
Right. Well, so I guess this sort of relates to anxieties, and I know this isn't a very sexy question, but it's relevant to me, and probably a lot of people, but the question of affordability and, what are the tips around that? Like, I assume there's, tips and tricks for like cheaper flights, cheaper places to stay, cheaper places to eat, finding resources for all that kind of stuff. And I'm aware this is probably very general information, and it would be more helpful if it was a specific location you're going to find information on that. But if there are any broad tips for that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I would say try to avoid peak seasons is the top one, meaning the top summer months and holidays like Memorial Day and Christmas, if possible. I realize some people with their work schedules can't avoid it, but if you can do what's called shoulder season, off season, go for it. But at the same time, check weather. For instance, if you're going to the Caribbean during hurricane season, it wouldn't be worth it, even if it's cheaper. So it's a mix of that, right? And these days with global warming, certain destinations are too hot in the summer. You can't walk around and explore comfortably. So timing, I think, is key. In terms of looking for flights, Google Flights is really useful. I like to track flights. You can figure out a couple itineraries and track them so you can see the prices go up and down. Also, multi-flights are good. I like, if you're going to Europe, for instance, personally, I feel if I'm going all the way there and spending all that money, hit a couple destinations while you're there. You can fly into one place like Berlin, and then you can take the train, maybe do a couple places within Germany or in other countries, and then you can fly out from another country, let's say Paris, and the flights are the price is probably the same or sometimes even cheaper than if you did a round trip to Berlin. Yeah, so that's one way to check out different places. Airbnb is great, or just like local apartment rentals, and
I've really fallen in love with, and I don't know how viable they are these days, but I really have liked hostels as far as cheap places to stay and a way to sort of meet other people, because you're kind of forced to be in a situation with other people. But I can see them also triggering some anxiety issues, and depending on the hostel,
with COVID,
sometimes you don't get. There are hostels that you do have more private rooms where it's not just everybody in bunk beds. The ones I've stayed in, I've actually done both. I did a trip to Austria with some friends where we stayed in a hostel where, the two other people I was with, we all shared one room, and we weren't sharing with other people, but there was a shared bathroom. But then when I traveled alone to Austin several years ago and stayed at a hostel there, which I loved, but I was in a bunk room with, I think it was 8 beds in it. And, it was different people in there through the course of my stay, which I found fascinating. And I, met some interesting people, but I'm not averse to that sort of situation, but I can definitely see that that's not for everybody. But hostels are usually very cheap. I just don't know how accessible they are any longer with COVID and, that sort of cohabitating thing, and what restrictions have been put on hostels these days.
Yeah, and I also think sometimes people focus too much on doing things at the lowest possible budget. The fact is, if you're spending on travel, allow yourself to enjoy the experience. Sometimes there's certain activities like a music festival, or if you ever wanted to try a certain outdoor activity, it just costs money. And that's yeah. So you either budget for it and go for it. It doesn't really make sense to go all the way there and kind of live on $10 a day and not really see anything too. So maybe cutting down your stay if it's getting more expensive, or looking at stopovers. I once did a stopover in Iceland on the way to Manchester, and that was free because it was a free included stopover. And yeah, things like that. And I wouldn't miss out on local food, but there's inexpensive local places that locals love to go to. And in Japan, for instance, my friends and I, we just love the convenience stores. We love places like Koko Ichiban, the curry place, and conveyor belt sushi. So things that are inexpensive, but still really local and delicious.
Yeah, I was definitely going to recommend that. Kind of try to live more like a local rather than like a tourist. So you're not going to the fancy tourist focused restaurants and things. You're going to little street vendors or little hole in the wall cafes, or even finding the local grocery store and grabbing stuff that way. But that's, how much of that you can do is going to be contingent on where you're staying. If you've got a kitchen, like if you were in a hostel where they have a kitchenette, you can do I'm grocery shopping for my food. If you're in a hotel where you just have a microwave, you're kind of stuck to going to more of a restaurant, but there are still street vendors and street foods, and there are cheap things that you can get that are inexpensive. And it's really about, what's important to you with this destination, and budget the majority of your money there. If there are things that aren't really a big deal to you, like if you're going for a subculture stuff and you want to see clubs and concerts, that should be where the majority of your money goes. Don't stay in the fancy hotel unless it's really helpful for you visiting those venues that you need to visit. Don't necessarily go to the fancy restaurants unless you really want to explore the culinary culture of that area. But really sort of focus on the best bang for your buck is putting that money towards what you're most interested in.
The thing you're there for.
Right.
Yeah. And just as a last tip, I would say also take into account transportation cost and time. I think sometimes people make a mistake of thinking, oh, this Airbnb is really cheap, I'll stay there. But it's so far away from all the places you want to see. And you end up spending more money on transportation or taxis or whatnot. And you waste time too if you're there for only a few days. I don't want to waste an hour traveling back and forth to the center of the city. So keep that in mind as well.
And then maybe maybe the last thing along this sort of train of thought is that I wanted to ask was, do you have any favorite cemeteries that you'd say are must visits for people that are traveling, or maybe any fun stories about cemeteries that you've visited in the past?
Yeah, sure. I try to go to cemeteries wherever I am. I think it's fascinating because you can see the different ways that people celebrate the dead, whether in Mexico, I'm lucky I got to experience Day of the Dead. So you can see people tending to the tombs of their ancestors, and in one place, even doing the brushing of the bones ceremony, which is beautiful.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I love seeing that. I love being in Romania and seeing the coffins that really look like Dracula is about to come out of them. You have these above the ground stone coffins, and the whole environment really is straight out of a horror movie. It's amazing. And I just love having experiences with friends too in cemeteries. I think it's often the company that you have that makes the top memory. So I remember being in Highgate Cemetery with two of my friends, and we found these wild strawberries growing from these ancient tombstones, and we would eat them. So the strawberries of the dead.
I love that.
Yeah, I definitely, I agree with you on the Mexican cemeteries. I found them to be the most fascinating because it is so different from what, as an American, I expect from a cemetery, with the gray stones or black stones, and just a very sort of, very monochromatic sculpture garden, where you go to a Mexican cemetery and it's just this riot of color and fascinating symbolism. And it's a wonderful change of pace that I really did enjoy. But probably one of my favorite cemeteries that I've visited was Cimetière de Montparnasse in Paris.
Oh, yeah.
It's not the famous one that everyone goes to because it's where, Jim Morrison was buried. That's the other one. I went there mostly because I'm a fan of Baudelaire, and that's where Baudelaire was buried. But I found it just fascinating to see all the different sculptures, the types of just work they had, the different things that they put as markers for graves, was just fascinating. That and the cemeteries in New Orleans are also very interesting with the.
Oh yeah, Metairie. Have you been to that one? Metairie.
I don't remember which one I was at. It was one of the big ones, but it was many years ago, and it was in conjunction with Convergence. So it was a whole bunch of other things that were happening. But I just went with some friends to one of the New Orleans cemeteries to see a New Orleans cemetery.
Yeah, the one I'm talking about is a little bit outside the city center, so it's not the famous tourist ones. And there are these huge white mausoleums, and there's these stately little homes almost. One, my favorite, it's shaped like a pyramid with a sphinx in the front. And it's like going to a gorgeous art exhibition. I feel when you go to cemeteries like this, you walk around and the sculptures are of the most exquisite quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got
Is that the one that Nicolas Cage had built, or that's a different one?
No, that's a different one. And Metairie also has the Weeping Angel. It's a reproduction of the famous Weeping Angel sculpture that's on those album covers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got a nice pyramid monument in, I think it's in Graceland here in Chicago as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty famous pyramid sculpture, as well as a couple other ones here.
Yeah, the Egyptian tombs are also not really cemeteries, but again, a fascinating way to celebrate the dead, and something that, again, you don't get the scale and this whole scope of it unless you're there. Inside the tombs, you can see the art everywhere surrounding you. It's just incredible what they were able to create all these thousands of years ago.
Yeah. It seems like you go out of your way when you can to spend time talking about art and its sociocultural impact, whether it's religious commentary or queer commentary or commentary on capitalism or whatever that is. I love that you also put a focus on artists outside of the traditional American and European tradition. So I wanted to ask, why is it important for you to do that? And then what are some of your favorite exhibits or artists that you've come across?
Yeah, so I've been blogging since 2007, so there's well over a decade of this focus. But even before starting to blog, that's something I simply gravitated towards because it's what I loved and what I felt drawn to and what my friends participated in. So it's not as if I felt there was a goal or agenda to portray this type of art and subjects or commentary. It's simply something that resonates with me and that I feel quite passionate about. And so favorite exhibits or artists, well, I was just in Miami last week and I got to visit Vincent Castiglia. I'm not sure if you know about him, but he paints in his own blood and he just opened a studio in Fort Lauderdale. So I love visiting artists like that and meeting them and seeing just the inspiration. Where do they come from? What is their process to paint in your own blood? He also does tattoos inspired by a Giger. And so for me, it's just a personal interest, I think, rather than trying to set forth some sort of message per se.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think, for me, and I can talk about something on your blog actually that brought this question up, but on this show, we've had a lot of discussions about the ways that goth has been associated with whiteness and how that can create a kind of exclusivity in some cases. And so for me, it's been important to talk about what those cases are, how I see that happening, talk with a bunch of different people about that kind of thing. But I wanted to ask you in the course of your travels, if you found goth or more broadly Gothic art and culture happening in ways that maybe are, I guess, unexpected outside of stereotypical expectations.
Sure. Did you say there was something specifically on my blog?
Yeah, well, for me, the thing that brought this question to my mind was in one of your blogs, you talked about the the Mosque Cathedral in Cordoba, Spain, and how it had its Gothic Islamic architecture, which it was beautiful, like absolutely gorgeous to look at. And it was really nice to learn about that. I had actually read an article, I think it was last year, about that sort of relationship between the Gothic architectural elements that came from Syria and Baghdad, and how there was some, like, this combination of Islamic architects working with Spanish architects, and then there was this sort of imitation mixed with later on sort of like some imperialism and that kind of thing, and how it was interesting to me because I also associated like Gothic architecture with European culture,
right?
But that was something that came along like centuries later and really had its roots in non-European cultures. So that was wonderful to see you bring that up and to talk about that in one of your posts.
Yeah, I agree. I think that often the focus is on Western art or spirituality. Even if you look at Satan, it's often like the devil in the Judeo-Christian culture. But I also like to look at demons and dark spirits worldwide that relate to art. For instance, there's Santa Muerte, the Lady of Death in Mexico. There's the demons like in Bali, Rangda, the demon lady. There are these horned oni or folklore demons in Japan. So while they don't come from the same background as Satan, it's interesting how I think maybe it's something in human nature. Cultures worldwide have always been drawn to this idea of dark spirits, dark elements, and both fascinated and afraid of them. But I think humans have created such beautiful art, whether it's demonic art, spiritual ideas, and these Gothic architectural themes based on that fascination. So that's something that I've been drawn to naturally, even if I didn't necessarily put in words. It's something that I find arresting and that I want to capture and talk about.
Well, let's talk about that actually then, because your newest book, which is scheduled to be out towards the end of this year, is called The Little Book of Satanism, A Guide to Satanic History, Culture, and Wisdom. Well, maybe I can just start with this. When did Satanism become part of your life? And then actually maybe as a follow-up, what drew you to more specifically the Satanic Temple rather than something like LaVeyan Satanism or esoteric Satanism or Luciferianism or some other flavor of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, since I was participating in goth subculture since I was a teen and in my early 20s, within that, you inevitably end up meeting people that identify as Satanists. And in New York and in North America, they tended to be LaVeyan Satanists. But I didn't really become that interested until I spent more and more time in Japan, including living in Tokyo for a while, because the satanic scene in Japan is just so vibrant and it's earnest. It's fascinating how they see it not necessarily through the same lens, but rather as a rebellion against the conformist society and for personal growth and fulfillment. So in Japan, you can find these fascinating shops and bars that are satanic themed, run by Satanists, and they have these parties like Black Veil in Osaka. It's an uplifting and just a really positive form, I feel, of Satanism, and that's really what first got me more interested. And then for me, I studied law, and I've always been interested in nonviolent movements and politics and ways to use the legal system for these means. So when the Satanic Temple came about, I started hearing news about them in 2013, 2014. And my friends and I, we just were really interested in their approach. We thought it was really a clever and interesting way to get involved. And so that's something that drew me to the Satanic Temple since then.
I don't know if you can expand on this. You mentioned the way that Satanism is more of a positive thing in Japan. I did kind of wonder how that would function, because a lot of, again, obviously in North America, Satanism a lot of times functions as a way to push back against Abrahamic religions, or more specifically Christianity. And in Japan, I wondered if Christianity had become as prolific there, or if it did function differently because it was in more of a culture of Shintoism and Buddhism with different, folklore and a different sort of mythos than we have in North America.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So in Japan, for instance, and in Hong Kong, very few people identify as Christian. It's something like 1%. And so over there, Christian iconography doesn't have the same feeling of blasphemy. If you have a pentagram or an upside down cross on your shirt, people aren't going to feel it's a reaction against Christianity. Actually, a funny aside, 666 in China means something completely different too. It means liu liu liu, which means kind of like smooth or skilled. So if you see some auntie wearing a 666 t-shirt, she's not hailing Satan. She's saying that she's a smooth person. So yes, you're right that because there isn't the same Judeo-Christian background in Asia, the expression of Satanism in places like Japan is different. And a lot of people on the streets, people who aren't involved, they just see it as a visual, edgy fashion. They don't see it as something countering their spiritual beliefs or anything like that. But I think it's
makes sense.
Yeah, it's absolutely not incompatible. I think a lot of people who identify as Satanists also have identification, say, with Buddhism or Judaism. I think it's not incompatible. Buddhism and, say, the 7 tenets of the Satanic Temple with the focus on empathy, compassion, and scientific reasoning, that these Enlightenment values are not at all incompatible with other systems of beliefs and philosophies.
Yeah. I think Buddhism in particular can be compatible with many different belief systems as well, I think, in a lot of ways. But I have a very... Trey, I think you have a more functional understanding of Buddhism than I do, but so maybe I shouldn't even bring that up in the first place. But
it's okay to bring it up and your understanding, and bring up your understanding is how you start a conversation.
I am interested
even if
in
it
Buddhism.
To be incorrect.
Yeah, I have listened to lectures on Buddhism and that kind of thing. I just don't have I'm not qualified to speak on it. Let's say that. But something I would like to speak about though is the article you wrote recently about exploring the potential resurgence of a satanic panic, which I don't remember the title of because I've accidentally closed the tab that I had that open in. But yeah, I'll have it linked in the show notes. I have that somewhere. I've lost it now. But I am curious to hear your thoughts on that, and sort of if you were personally impacted by the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s, and then how you see that reflected in today's culture.
Yeah, I think it's a big misunderstanding that the Satanic Panic is over. I think it's still ongoing. And to those who aren't familiar, it's this idea that really burst forth in the 80s and 90s. And this is something I cover in my upcoming book, where people started having this fear that Satanists were everywhere, corrupting teenagers with heavy metal, and that there was this underground conspiracy of Satanists trying to traffic children and abuse them. So as crazy sounding as these ideas are, they really took hold and led to real suffering, false accusations, trials, and whatnot, people's lives being ruined by this, especially people who were goths and outsiders who got caught in these webs of accusations. And you still see that today in things like Pizzagate, where I don't know if you remember that. It was yeah. For those who don't know, there was this rumor that Hillary Clinton and other Democrats were having a satanic cabal meetings in a pizza restaurant in DC. And okay, sure, it's a stupid rumor, but it led to real repercussions where someone showed up with a gun and even fired a shot inside the restaurant. And then you have the recent QAnon drops that have all these satanic. Yeah,
they're following the exact same thing, and it does seem to be the constant drumbeat is about. It's the think of the children thing, but the child abuse and child sex trafficking is always sort of the thing that it goes towards, whether it's a satanic panic or Pizzagate or QAnon. It's always about this cabal of people who are for some reason interested in sex trafficking children, which, you know, is sort of the ultimate taboo. So I understand why it's sort of hit on so much, but it's a little bit.
Oh, yeah. And I go into
this
in the book, which I loved researching and writing about it, because you can see throughout history, even before the 20th century, there's always been the scapegoating of the other, of outsiders, which kind of leads us back to Goths too, because Goths are often misunderstood and blamed and even violently acted upon, right? So people throughout history have blamed people that they don't like, that they feel were outside the norms. They've called them Satanists. And the whole child abuse thing, it's long withstanding, but it's also came through Michelle Remembers, this book that came out in the 1980s. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I'm not as familiar with that one, but I definitely have heard about it.
Yeah, and just preying upon these fears, like you said, of children being corrupted.
Yeah.
And movies and pop culture kind of feed into that as well. You have The Exorcist, you have The Omen, Rosemary's Baby. So all these elements kind of come together to feed into a panic that still goes on today.
Yeah, I do. I have plenty of personal anecdotes about this because I was a baby in the 80s, but my parents really latched on to the fears of the conspiracy theories of that era because they were conservative Christians and that was part of their community. So as I was growing up, I grew up with the Satanic Panic media produced both from the church and from broader American culture, because it wasn't just a Christian thing. It was widespread, right? My dad had VHS and cassette tape recordings of all kinds of stuff that was broadcast. So I would watch a lot of this on repeat because, again, very controlled environment. I only had access to so many different things. So like there was a serialized Christian audio drama from Focus on the Family I listened to. They did a multi-part series about kids getting into Dungeons and Dragons, which culminated in them summoning a demon in the woods, and then they had to be saved by one of the older main characters who rebuked the demon with the power of Jesus, right? And that kind of thing, that kind of thing seeped into almost all Christian media for a very long time. There was that, like you were saying, that fear of secret covens of satanic witches infiltrating communities in everything. I remember a music video by a band, or I guess it was just a guy, but a band called Carmina. I think it was called Witch's Invitation, which was about a confrontation with that exact thing. There was a Christian TV show I used to watch called Fire by Night, and they did a 2-part series called Satanism Unmasked that had people like Sean Sellers in there, who was on death row for murdering his parents when he was 18, and he linked that to being possessed by the devil.
Right. Yeah.
But in the video, they linked that to those supposed like satanic cults that were proliferating throughout the country, that were conducting these ritual murders and sexual abuse. Lauren Stanford was in there, or what's her name? Lauren Stratford, I think. She wrote the book Satan's Underground, which was, she was talking about being a baby breeder in a satanic cult. And she was the person who went on to, after that got exposed, she went on to say that she was a Holocaust survivor. And then eventually it came out that she had like this history of mental illness. And she was, of course, lying about all this stuff. But the thing was, though, like, there were dozens and dozens of these people that were doing rounds and like interviews in churches and in these little like niche Christian media video productions that I was watching. I've seen dozens of these. Like, we'd be here all day if I talked about all of these people. How many times I heard people talk about being ex-satanic priests sharing, the secrets of their covens and that kind of thing. It was insane. And like you said, dozens of people went to jail for supposed satanic activity because there was like they were doing this, resurfacing repressed memories, supposedly, to bring up these with children, things that never happened. And because you had people like Geraldo Rivera and all these daytime TV shows interviewing Xena Shrek and the Church of Satan and stuff, there were, I think that the broader American public were predisposed to believe this was going on. So then when you had the, juries and things, they were already had these sort of beliefs and were ready to, and then you had these bad psychological experiments and things. So then when you had people like Bob Larson and these things that now have been memed to death, where you've got people like linking Furbies and He-Man and Pokemon cards to demonology and witchcraft and whatever, that just made these my parents believed that Dungeons and Dragons was a literal spell book to summon demons, like a step-by-step, here's how you summon a demon to get money and sex, right? Like you said, it was QAnon, but it was in the court system. It was on TV, so when it was being presented, the more extreme stuff in the closed Christian circles, it was granted that higher level of legitimacy. Like we could, into the 2000s, my brother and I literally couldn't tell our parents that we were playing D&D because she still believed it was a process by which to summon demons. And a lot of the adults in the what was the denomination? First Assembly of God Church that she went to believed that kind of thing. And it was like, that's not the official doctrine of that church, but it was so pervasive among Christian culture that it just has hung around, how many years later.
Oh, absolutely.
And personally for me, sorry, I know I'm going on like this, I'm unloading my trauma here. Sorry. It was just, being in middle school, it was difficult for me because I was getting into metal music. As I got older, I was getting into goth music. And like you said, it was linking Satanism to these genres, this rock and roll music. And so I had this learned suspicion of the evils of Satanism, that were coming into contact with these things that weren't actually evil. Like I met someone who was a Wiccan in school that I became friends with, later found out she was a Wiccan, and realized she's not skinning dogs in the forest to sacrifice to Satan, which, kind of destroyed my worldview of that whole thing. So, and kind of deconstructed my belief of that part of my faith. And so, actually maybe the funniest thing for me was how attractive Satanism was, even though it was being presented as evil, because like that music video I mentioned, which is Invitation, the satanic, whatever he was supposed to be, the warlock, you get to see his house. And this was long before I had seen anything that was goth. It was covered in pentagrams and skulls and lace and velvet, and the demons showed up, and they had all these really cool like practical monster effects and designs and things. And I would watch that over and over and over just because I thought it looked so fucking cool, even though it was supposed to be like pure unadulterated evil. But it was just so visually attractive to me that it just didn't. So I don't know. The devil was always sexy, I guess. That's the end of my story.
It's fascinating to hear your perspective, because you asked me whether I was impacted. I didn't grow up with any religious background, so not at all just the way you explained your growing up, but it's still in the popular culture, and it's in the air. People thinking Satanists are bad people doing crimes and terrible things. So one of the main goals in writing this book was to dispel these misconceptions and to present a fair and honest, accurate portrayal of the history and development of Satanism and what people practice today. What are the philosophical underpinnings to hopefully help people to move on from these terrible lies and misconceptions and stereotypes of Satanists.
Yeah. Well, so let me ask that then. What are some of the ways that Satanism defines itself? Because obviously there are different beliefs and different ways of structuring that. But if you can kind of speak to some of that, because the conception would be that it's largely defined against Christianity or as a reaction to Christian ideology.
Yeah, I think people perceive it as that, but I would say that in fact Satanism has its own affirmative values that stand apart from that. And of course there's so many different types of Satanism. There's theistic, there's atheistic, compassionate Satanism, and there's the Church of Satan, the Satanic Temple, and whatnot. So it's definitely something that can't be summed up. But I would say there are some general themes that many Satanists feel they relate to, such as rejecting tyrannical authority, such as the way that Lucifer stood up to God and fell from heaven. So rejecting conventional moral judgments and championing nonconformity, empathy, this personal expression, whether it's through sexuality or things that the status quo might consider transgressive. And also pursuing knowledge, taking a rational, scientific-based approach, rejecting superstition. And again, people relate to Satan in different ways, but for many Satanists, he's a symbol of individuality and rebellion that they can sort of strive to be. And people also engage in some form of community, kind of like the goth, like what is goth, right? Often community or having some sort of interaction is quite important to many.
Yeah. Now, something I'm curious about from a, I guess, worldview, ontological perspective is, and I guess something that I argue with other goths about is the way that we tend to define ourselves against an abstracted other. So the main, quote unquote, the mainstream, for example, where we like to understand ourselves and our group as diverse and complex, and then label the opposing group as homogeneous and internally coherent. So when it comes to Satanism, and I don't expect you to speak for all Satanists, right? This is just from your perspective, your experience, your opinions. What might a satanic philosophy around perceiving other people or agents and their place in the world be? So, for example, would a Satanist tend to view other Satanists as free-thinking individuals while viewing Christians as followers who aren't open to changing their minds or that kind of thing?
I think you find this within any subculture, and goth,
yes,
of course, where people within that, they try to be the one true whatever it is. So you see people within Satanism saying they're the one true Satanism, or it should only be a certain way. I'm not one of those people. I just, try to see it from a broader perspective. And I think there's also not necessarily this one against the other. I think if you actually dive into it, some examples are when the Satanic Temple tried to emplace their Baphomet monument to provide a viewpoint neutrality because the Ten Commandments monument was already there. So, in fact, some Christian pastors stood up in support for them, saying that other religions should be able to have their monuments up there, and that it should be minority religions should have the same standing for free speech and representation and freedom of expression. So you see people who are Christians who are they're open to having conversations about ideological differences in a respectful manner. So I think it's not fair to paint anyone, whether Satanist or Christian, with a certain brush. I think it's really individual how people approach it. And if you have conversations and if you take a more open-minded approach, I think that sort of leads to better outcomes for understanding.
Yeah. From my end, I'm always advocating for breaking down dichotomies and understanding the world as complex and interconnected, and the people in the world as complex and interconnected, rather than fixed, I guess, and determined. So when we're talking about the devil, I think if you ask two different Christians about the devil, you're going to get two different opinions about who or what the devil is and how the devil operates in the world, even if you might assume that they're taking part in the same cosmology, I guess. Not just like technical theological differences, but sort of practical day-to-day like behaviors or folklore differences or opinions or rituals and that kind of thing. And then I think that those beliefs are going to impact how they view political issues or moral issues or interpersonal issues, that kind of thing. The thing that bugs me about goths is and again, like you said, this is a common behavior. It's not specific to anybody. For goth, though, I think this kind of comes out of this idea sometimes that people can view goth as this sort of identity of an essentialist individual, but I don't want to get into the metaphysics of it. But the example I use is musically, goths will talk about the music they listen to as being diverse with this wide range of tonalities and subjects that are talked about that are socially important or humorous or philosophically complex. And then they'll turn around and uncharitably talk about these huge groups of other people, these mainstream audiences, saying they only listen to simplistic, vapid pop music, right?
Yeah.
And so they completely ignore the complexity of this entire group of people just to simplify their view of the world or make themselves feel important or whatever. So I just think it's, like you said, it's important to have conversations, maybe just take some time to break down and examine root causes and locality and our place in the world. So, all right. Well, last question on Satanism here. Something in the bio for your upcoming book that piqued my interest that I was hoping you could explain for me, because I wasn't entirely sure what direction you were coming at this from, was it mentioned that Satanism in part stands for free inquiry and personal liberty. And I thought that was interesting. So I was curious if you could explain what the concept of free inquiry and personal liberty means in the context of Satanism.
Sure. So that's something that not all Satanists, but many find important to them. And I would say a lot of it stems from the Romantic writers and poets looking to John Milton's Paradise Lost and finding inspiration from that story, seeing Satan actually as a classical hero. From that reading, they see him as rising up against this oppressive ruler of heaven. And there's the famous line about better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. Mm-hmm. So seeing him as the rebel, someone who's willing to stand up for freedom, for personal values, and especially in this day and age when reproductive rights are being rolled back, free speech is being crushed, and all these democratic freedoms are often on the line. So yeah, I think it's a really big part of what a lot of people feel is integral to Satanism, to be able to express yourself as you are and to honor these Enlightenment values that are often so easily taken away.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I was just curious about how, if that leaves room for, I guess, an ethic of community responsibility and working together rather than a system of individual strength kind of thing. But I think that it sounds like that's sort of part of what you're talking about there.
Sure. And
standing up for marginalized groups, that kind of thing.
Well, I should also know not all Satanists take that approach.
Oh,
so
for sure.
Yeah, the Church of Satan, they don't think Satanism should be political. So, but of course, for many Satanists, just standing up for your own personal rights and expression is really important.
Cool. So then before we wrap up, I have a pair of questions that I am asking each guest this year to sort of get a breadth of opinions on what's going on in the world from a bunch of different people. And so the first question of the two is, what are you concerned or worried about, or something you would change about goth right now?
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear your opinion on this too, but because of COVID, there hasn't been the clubs and touring and festivals, and it's still not coming back. It's a mix. Of course, you want to make sure people are safe, but at the same time, it's really disappointing when your friends who are in bands, who are artists, aren't able to do their shows and to go on tour. People aren't able to meet up and experience these events that, for me, growing up, were so important, these experiences. And I think that's really unfortunate about this current age. So I don't know how or when that can change, because it's important to have the public measures in mind, but it just seems to be harder and harder. We have the internet to link people, and there's virtual events. People can connect remotely, but it's just not the same.
It's not.
It's really not.
No.
Yeah. So I do worry a bit about people missing out on these experiences, especially as life gets harder, just with climate chaos and economic issues on the rise, social conflicts. And I think the reality is it's just going to get harder and more limited. And that's something that's really sad.
Yeah, there's also sometimes just a smaller window for people to experience that too, because we've got, age restrictions to keep you from going when you're too young. And then there are, quote unquote, adult responsibilities that can make attending some of those events and things much more difficult when you've got a full-time job or a family or things like that. So there's this sort of window of time that you're kind of free to experience that sort of excitement of the subculture and clubs and concerts very freely. And for those people who are in that window right now, it's, I feel for them.
Yeah. I can't imagine being 18, 19 right now and not being able to live somewhere else and do all these things. But it is what it is. And I do think I personally know some people who lived completely different lives until they were 40. And then they got very much into the goth scene. Someone I'm thinking of who went to Japan and went around the world. So for anyone listening, it's never really an age limit or limits on what you can or cannot do. It's what you make of things.
It's more work is the main point. Because I'm in my 40s and I still go out regularly, but I do acknowledge that plenty of people find that difficult. They find, this sort of golden age around, like you said, 18, 19 through college, maybe the mid 20s. But after that, it just becomes more of a challenge. Not impossible. There's definitely plenty of people who do it well into their elderly years. But yeah, it's an acknowledgement of those people who, in the golden time of being able to have the time and ability to do it, if you can't right now, it's just particularly hard.
And then the flip side of that, or I guess the mirror to that question, is, of course, what are you excited about with goth right now?
Yeah, I think it's something you mentioned earlier, the new emphasis on diversity and seeing goth in other countries, which is something I tried to do through my work, especially in blogging. I love seeing how people express goth within the context of their unique culture, even spirituality. I'm thinking of a goth makeup artist I know, and she wears a hijab, but she does these fantastic flamboyant Gothic looks. Or people in Mexico who maybe they kind of draw upon Day of the Dead imagery and Santa Muerte and bring that history and that spirituality into their expression of goth subculture. I mentioned the people in Japan and Myanmar, the Asian goth scene, the way they dress and the music they make is so electrifying. So to me, I'm glad more people are aware of goth and its manifestations around the world, especially because of the internet and social media. People are able to more easily share their music and their photos and videos of the events. And I think that has really been a huge step in seeing the diversity and in connecting us.
So, and with that, I will say thank you so much for your time. Again, the book, which will be available later this year, but is available now for pre-order, is called The Little Book of Satanism, A Guide to Satanic History, Culture, and Wisdom. I will also be sure to link everyone to your website, lacarmina.com, and all your social accounts in the show notes, which are, again, under La Carmina. I'd also recommend folks check out your Satanic Show and Tell TV show, which I've quite enjoyed watching. But thank you again for your time. This has really been a lovely experience. Thanks for coming on.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to talk about these topics I love with you.
All right, that means it's time for the album review.
Album review.
All right, this month we are talking about an album, or I guess maybe you would call this an EP. I guess it doesn't really actually matter. But it's from the band Deathhawk, who are out of St. Petersburg, Russia. They formed in 2021, and that's really all the information I have about them. Without further ado, I suppose, let's play a track from the album, of which I'm not even going to try and pronounce. And I'm going to play track 5. If you would like to see the name of that track, you can click on the Bandcamp link that is in the show notes. So just like the album or EP or whatever we would like to call it. My review is also going to be short and punchy. I quite enjoyed this. I guess you would call this death rock. What do we have for the tags on this? Punk, Batcave, death rock, goth, gothic, post-punk.
And gunk. I like the gunk
I read that
one.
as gothic. Yeah, no, gunk.
No,
That's
it's gunk.
wonderful. Yeah,
I looked it up. I'm not really sure what it is. It looks like there's something about like noise rock type things with gunk. I thought it was goth punk was what I was initially thinking about it, but
that's man, they should call, instead of saying death rockers and death rock fashion should just be death rock, and then death rock music should be called gunk. I like that.
It looks like that already means something else, though. At least when I clicked on the tag. And then it's also an Urban Dictionary.
Okay. Urban Dictionary. That's the authority for sure.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you the things I like about it. It has that punk chorus of voices on a lot of the tracks that a lot of good punk albums have. It makes you feel really good about shouting along to it in the car if you know what they're saying, of course, or if you don't know what they're saying because a bunch of other people are shouting, so you're also shouting, and we're all shouting. Everybody's shouting. It's a good time. Who doesn't love shouting, right?
15 minutes of hate.
Yeah. I love the prominence of the bass in a lot of the songs. I think it gives the music a super funky quality that I really love, and I don't think is something that features in a lot of goth and death rock, especially modern goth and death rock. But I think that really makes this album shine, right? And I think that's good because an unfortunate side effect of the death rock revival, I believe, is that people get the impression that death rock it all sounds the same. And I think one of the cool things about death rock is that it can be very creative and playful and do weird stuff. Not that this album necessarily goes way off the rails and does anything incredibly creative or interesting, but I think death rock can do interesting things musically that other goth genres can't do, and I don't think it necessarily gets the recognition for that. So I did really like the funk elements of some of the songs here, and I don't think the songs on the album are all the same song either. I think track 3 has kind of a swing sensibility to it. And overall, I think the album has a pretty good dynamism in general. There's some definite, as ignorant as I am about music genres outside of goth, I would, in my unexpert opinion, say there are some dub and funk influences. I already said funk, but whatever. Which really does give it a good dancey, energetic feel. And like I said, it helps it avoid that feeling like it's just the album is actually just one long song rather than a collection of different songs. Whereas the new Bauhaus track took that to the extreme where it's 4 different songs in one song. But that's a whole other thing. All the tracks are short. The track we played was the longest at a cool 3 minutes. Most of them are a breezy 2 minutes. And they're all at a pretty frenetic tempo as well. So standing at 5 tracks, it blows past you pretty quick. And it's a fun little listen, I think. So that's, a short album, short review. I quite liked it, and I'd give it a 3 out of 5.
Cool. I was a little bit more mixed about it, but I'm sure that's not a surprise to anybody who's listened to this before. I'm very, very specific with what I like in my death rock, and the closer it is to punk, usually the less it is, less I like of it, just because I'm not necessarily a massive punk fan. But this album was, like you'd mentioned, it had a lot of variety to it. So it wasn't, like I said, just one long song. Like sometimes punk can be, they just hammer on the that punk drum beat, and they put those three chords in there, and they shout and scream over it, and that's your punk song. It's very lo-fi garage rock revival type thing, which is fine, and I appreciate that for what it is, but it's not necessarily something that gets me really excited about music, because it doesn't pique that little brain curiosity of, ooh, this is something new and different, because that's not what punk's function is. Punk is just meant to be, it's comforting, it's supposed to be something that's communal, you all join in, like you all shout together, and that's great, but that doesn't have as much of an appeal to me. So when I first came into it, the first track didn't really grab me all. I actually felt that was more of a horror punk really than than death rock. It definitely had that sort of fun kind of Misfits thing, and the howling was fun. And I think the translation is something about the moon. So I'm assuming it has something to do with werewolves with the howling, and the translation of the title evoking the moon to some degree, but it's pure guesswork, because I definitely don't speak Russian, and I didn't ask my friend who spoke Russian what it was about. So yeah, I just listened to it, and it was fine, but that was very straight ahead, pretty much punk, with that sort of B-movie guitar work that you get with that sort of horror punk type aesthetic, and then the howling and all that. So that was not necessarily really getting me into it. But then the second and third track were more of a post-punk, I felt. They were doing what you were saying, Danny, with they brought the bass more to the fore, which is one of the hallmarks of post-punk in general. They had kind of those melodic bass lines, which I find more interesting, because I'm a huge bass fan. So I love it when the bass gets to shine a little bit more than just sort of melding in with the drums on as just the rhythmic underpinning of what's normally just guitars and voices. I did like the gang vocals that you also called out. I like the whole group seemed to be singing along, and that does, like you say, bring the audience in to the environment. And it's one of those hallmarks of punk that I do like, that idea of, that whole communal shared experience. So I did enjoy those two tracks. I thought track 4 again was a little bit more punk leaning, not quite as much as track 1, but that one did lean more towards punk. I didn't really have a lot of comments on it. It was okay. And then track 5 was definitely my favorite. I felt that had the most sort of variety to it. It was also the longest one. So that maybe gave it a little bit more time to breathe and to evolve. But, I'm a big fan of, more tribal drumming style, and that wasn't the standard kick snare kind of thing you get with a lot of punk songs. They were doing a lot of tom work and some of those side of things. So I found it much more interesting, and it had more of an atmospheric sound. And I found actually the vocals in that particular one were a little bit reminiscent of Roz in Christian Death too. It had some of that same, had some of a similar timbre there. And, Christian Death is, one of the handful of at least major death rock bands that I actually do really enjoy. So anything that sort of harkens to that sort of area of death rock is definitely going to get me more interested than ones that are leaning more towards the sort of punk misfit side of things. But yeah, I enjoyed it. It wasn't a bad album. It was certainly a quick and breezy listen. I also listened to their other album, at least in Bandcamp. They had a slightly newer one that came out, which was actually like this one a little bit better.
I don't know how
it was released in December.
Oh yeah, look at that.
Yeah, so
I completely missed that somehow. Jesus Christ. Okay,
it's okay. Whenever I pull up a Bandcamp page, I always try to find that discography link, and I'm really frustrated.
It's literally right on the same page, so I don't know how I didn't see that.
It is, but I find that half the time when I go to that, it takes me to like a label discography page, which I find really frustrating, because that's just overwhelming. Maybe it'll introduce me to a lot of different things, but I'm like, no, I clicked on it because I'm interested in this one band, and I don't really feel like I have the time to dig into this whole discography for a label. So yeah, I can find that discography button to be hit and miss, but yeah, I did click on that, listen to the other album, which is another short, like 5 or 6 track EP type thing. Very much in the same feel. I felt it was kind of an average of the two styles. It was not quite as punk as the more punk tracks in this, not quite as post-punk as the more post-punk tracks in this. Kind of did a happy medium, and I thought it was a little bit more samey across the board, but I didn't listen. I listened to this album because it was the one we were reviewing a lot more than the other one. I just kind of clicked on the other one to listen through it just out of curiosity. But overall, I thought it's a good album. If you like death rock, I think you'll like the album. I mean, I don't think it's a bad album for death rock fans. I'm just not the biggest death rock fan, so I'm not going to love it. But I'd say it's a solid 3. Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, with that, we're going to do a unique, different version of Sinister Suggestions.
Ooh, I'm excited now.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
My thought for this, for what I was going to recommend this time around was, and I don't look, my brain doesn't work right. Okay, so I don't know why it took me so long to think of this, but basically every month when I'm trying to come up with which album we're going to review for the album review, I listen through a lot of different bands, and then I have to pick one. But a lot of these bands are bands either I'd never heard of or are bands that I think maybe many people hadn't heard of. And obviously, considering that the music aspect of goth is very important to both of us, I thought, why am I not doing a brief, hey, here's a bunch of interesting music that I found. Here's a little bit about the album, and here's a link to it. So here's a bunch of music you can go listen to for the month that maybe you hadn't heard of. Why leave that to just the DJs? Why can't I have that curated on the show for random things that I found? Maybe you find something interesting. Even if my ramblings of what I thought the album sounded like are completely unhelpful, at least you'll have some Bandcamp links to go check out when the show is over, right? So I'm going to try and speed run through a list of albums that I listened to that I thought are worth checking out, giving you a brief description, probably nonsensical description of what the album or EP or single in a lot of cases is, and then you can go check those out for yourself. So, and there's a bunch of these, so I'm going to try and go, I mean, maybe there's fewer than I thought there were, but there's a good number. So the first one is a 5-track demo from the band Coins Paralysis, which is a band from Montreal. I'd probably classify this as a post-punk sort of thing. I think it's more gets into the just experimental side of things. Really enjoyed it. I think they kind of played around with instruments and just kind of had fun with breakdowns and guitar riffs. It's also very funky. You could almost kind of take these 5 songs and say they're basically one long song with a couple interludes in there, because there is kind of a theme that runs through all of them. But it's real weird and creative. And I love that kind of thing, and I know you love that kind of thing. So that's my first recommendation. My second recommendation is the album, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, but the new instrumental album from Angels Arcana. And this is from, I guess I can call him my friend now, Bobis, who I'm sure I'm saying his name incorrectly, and he's probably listening to this, so I'm so sorry. From Athens, Greece. He's also in the band Hada, who we reviewed. Look, I'm a filthy American, all right? Please forgive me. Who we reviewed a year or two ago, whose album we both absolutely loved. And I fell in love with this album. This was my place of peace. I shared this on Facebook for a while. It's like a vampire soundtrack mixed with 90s goth atmospheric melodies mixed with medieval and pagan acoustics. And there's a wider range of influence throughout the album as well. Those are just the things I picked up on that I personally enjoy. But there's a whole range of musical influences throughout the album. And there are no vocals on this album, but if you prefer something with vocals, look up Angel's Arcana. I mean, they're on Spotify, they're on Bandcamp, they're in a bunch of places. He's got other albums with vocals that are also incredible. I really, really love the other albums. This was just the newest one, so this is what I listened to this month. And highly recommend. I don't think very many people know about this band. He's a wonderful person, very sweet guy. Definitely recommend checking out his music. It's just really fucking good. So that's my second recommendation. Next recommendation is from Harbaloo. Again, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. Harbaloo. That's gotta be even more wrong. Called the new single called The End of Summer, which is going to be on their upcoming album, which is coming out, I think maybe next month. I don't know exactly. This is more of what I love from this band, basically. It's neo-romantic, sort of in the vein of Dine Lakaien. It's the kind of song that I love to wash over me, make me melt or cry or sweep me away to another world, or something to listen to while I hold the hand of someone I love. I've listened to it like a dozen times already. It's absolutely gorgeous, lush. Really enjoyed that. Next recommendation is another single, just one track, a song called Mirror Twin by the band Harsh Symmetry. Brand new artist that I know nothing about, but they put out this one track, which is a great 80s darkwave sounding track. Super dancey, makes you want to shake your ass. What more do you want? Next recommendation actually was a band that came up during the course of the interview. Release on Bandcamp from 13th Moon called Blood or Love. This is a 3-track EP that was put out to support the crisis in Ukraine. The songs are actually from 2006 and were recorded in 2020. But I would assume most Western listeners, like myself, had not heard these songs. So you can go get this and listen to it on Bandcamp now. I really enjoyed it. Fun death rock. You get some goth carnivalesque breakdowns and some groovy tracks, and I thought it was really fun to listen to. Next recommendation, the newest album, probably something most people have heard already. Newest album from Winter Severity Index, Disgello. We'll go with that. I was shocked that it's been 5 years since the last Winter Severity Index album came out. I feel like I was listening to that 2 years ago. I talk about a senior moment. Wow. But this is a really good entry into their discography. I feel like it had it fits within what you expect from the band, while also having some more modern sounds that resonate with the current darkwave landscape, without sounding too derivative or too much like something you've heard from I don't know, Twin Tribes already or somebody like that. They do that thing that I love with this kind of music, which is where I find myself starting the album and then at some point I realize I've closed my eyes and I'm lost in another world, dancing like an idiot in my room with no sense of time or place. So I really enjoyed this album and the journey that it took me on. And I think this album deserves its own review because it's really varied and intricate, a lot like the Angels Arcana album. But I highly recommend it if you haven't heard it already, which I assume a lot of you have. Next recommendation is the album Haunted Castles by the band French Police. And I'm recommending this primarily because I had not heard of this band, so I'm guessing other people hadn't heard of this band. It's from 2020. I think I probably would have liked it more in 2020. But as it stands now, I think I've just heard too many albums that sound like this. And I don't think there's really anything different between this album and like She Passed Away or Rendezvous or Twin Tribes or who's the big darkwave band that everybody mentions that hasn't had an album in a couple years, with the two dudes, Drab Majesty. It's a good solid darkwave album. It's definitely something I dance to at a club. It's not bad, it's just kind of generic, but I thought it was still worth a mention. Next recommendation, I told you there were a bunch of these. A single from the band Sacred Skin called Earthbound. This is their newest single, also a band I've never heard of. It's basically a song right out of the 80s. It could have been on one of the Lost Boys soundtracks or something like that. It's not like goth 80s necessarily. It's more pop 80s. So depending on how hard you go for the 80s in general, I guess, will inform how much you like that track. But I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. I could smell the Aquanet. So yeah, it's good. Check it out. The next recommendation is, and Trey, maybe you've heard this already, is the newest album from Collide.
I actually haven't. Definitely look that up though.
It's called Notes from the Universe. So my very short thoughts on this is it was certainly something I didn't expect in 2022, which was a new Collide album. But I thought it was really good. Actually, I was not expecting this to be good at all. I really wasn't. I thought it was a tight album. It sounds like Collide, even though I haven't listened to a Collide album in, Satan knows how many years. I still immediately knew it was them. The album is diverse enough was diverse enough to keep my interest, and it didn't overstay its welcome, which was something I was definitely worried about, especially because primarily my main listening to Collide was through the Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines soundtrack, even though I did have a couple other albums. It was just, for me, one of those bands that was kind of not a one-trick pony, but like a very specific sound. And this may just have been because I didn't listen to enough of their music. But I was a little worried about it, but it didn't overstay its welcome. Some of the tracks I liked more than others. It's not a goth album, I wouldn't say, obviously, but like they're playing with a lot of rock and roll and a lot of like those tropes and familiar sounds and those things. So I thought it was really good, and something, especially for a nostalgia trip that isn't too formulaic, I guess you could say. Definitely check that out.
Already doing it.
Next recommendation is the Red Moon Macabre is the band, and the album is called Werewolf Vampire Mastered EP. And guess what? This album is about werewolves and vampires, and it's really grungy and dirty sounding goth rock, more in the sort of Fields of the Nephilim vein than Sisters of Mercy. And the songs are all either about lycanthropy or vampirism, and the lycanthropy stuff is really cool because it's not only super fun, but it's refreshing. Especially considering how obsessed goths are with vampires, it really does give everything kind of a fresh feeling. The vampire songs are about like Countess Bathory and Dracula, which I think are still unique enough in the way they present those to be good. The album does feel closer to a metal album at times, which again I think puts it in sort of that Fields of the Nephilim sort of vein. But some of the tracks are more of a dirge and more like grindy. And the vocals and lyrics are really well done as well. It does a really good blend of gothic rock and metal, which is something I honestly don't think I've heard done well at all since the Nephilim. Honestly, I'd be hard pressed to really think of a good example that I personally have enjoyed. So this was I really enjoyed this EP, so definitely recommend that. And then maybe my last recommendation here is the new album from Molly Nilsson called Extreme, which isn't really necessarily within the goth milieu, but it is in that sort of like hyper 80s milieu if you're into that sort of sound. And it is what an album. That will take you on a journey. It's not really the kind of music I generally listen to, but it is so diverse and so 80s, but so interesting. I don't really even know if I have the adjectives to describe this album. Just because I'm not, it's not familiar to me, but it's really good. And this is the first thing I've heard from this artist as well, someone from Germany. Really, really interesting, and something, if you're curious to looking for something adjacent, sort of, I guess, to goth, I would check it out and see if you like it. I think you'll either really like it or really not like it. So, and that is my Sinister Suggestions.
Wow, yeah, that is quite a list you got there.
Yeah. And I think I'm gonna try and do something maybe not as long of a list, but something similar each month. And if people like it or don't like it, tell me, and I'll maybe do that or not do that.
I mean, it makes perfect sense that since you already are listening to, or at least investigating all these to find the one you select, it also makes maybe a little less pressure on the one you select, and that you're not forsaking all of these other ones and having all that pressure like, oh, but if I pick this one and only highlight this one, nobody will hear about all these other great ones, and how do I choose? Yeah. So having all of these sort of runners up, or here's other things that are interested in you if we didn't choose to review it, I think that's a great way of doing it. So yeah, I like that. That's I'm certainly a fan of that. I definitely opened up a bunch of those. For me, I'm unfortunately not like usual. I've been straining to find, or at least remember things that I've consumed lately, and I haven't really done a lot of stuff of note recently. I guess one band that I found recently, which is not really goth at all, is more of a pop/dance pop type band, but I find her really intriguing, is the artist Aurora. She's relatively new. Let's see, she came out, her first album was in, looks like 2016, but she released an album this year. I've watched a few of her things. She reminds me a little bit of Bjork, maybe not quite as weird as Bjork, but a similar thing. She also happens to be, no, she's Norwegian. I was going to say, I don't think she's Icelandic, but I know she's Scandinavian to some degree. So she's Norwegian. But she's been getting a bit of hype. She's done, the Tiny Desk concerts. And I think she actually, I want to say she performed at like the Nobel Peace Prize, like big event that announces those sorts of things. So she's got some interesting tracks. I find her really enjoyable. She's got a very interesting sort of high, almost childlike voice, and a very interesting way of making phrases. And probably my favorite thing, and I'll probably send a link of it, but there was this great video of a concert that she did in a church. That's just a beautiful atmosphere. I found it really interesting, so I'll probably shoot a link to that you can include in the show notes for Aurora as just to introduce her. But yeah, not goth, but certainly I can see it appealing to those who are interested in some of the more ethereal female fronted goth bands, because she's got some similarities to that, but yeah, she's very, very tangential to goth. But I've definitely been enjoying her stuff recently. And then I've also been watching with a friend of mine the show Owl House on Disney Plus, which is really an interesting show.
I've been meaning to watch that.
It's good.
Yeah.
I've been liking it. It's really good. It's a quirky little kids, cartoon type thing, but it deals with some interesting, more adult themes. It's got some same-sex romance stuff. It's got some gender nonconformity stuff happening on it too. And it's a little bit just weirdness, and it's a demon realm, and deals with ideas of conformity versus independence and stuff like that. So I've been enjoying it. It's light fare. It's not deep and amazing, but I think it's fun. So I recommend it. It's a good show, and it's definitely kid friendly. So for those of you who are goth parents and want something that's a little quirky but kid friendly, but also maybe appealing to adults and maybe leading your kids down that sort of nonconformist path, I think it's a good way to go. So that's kind of it for me. I don't really have a lot, but I'm definitely going to be digging into all the things that you recommended, Danny.
No, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. That's Owl House has been on my list for a while. And you know what? I'll also just say, I'm not going to go into it because we'll be here all night, but last month, going from 4 hours to 115 hours, Elden Ring is one of the best games I've ever played, and I definitely recommend it. So I'll say that. And if you've never played if you've ever been interested in a From Software Dark Souls game and you've not played one, I recommend it. I recommend you check this one out. My wife, who has never played a Dark Souls game, is playing it and is getting through the game. So that is a miracle in itself. Now, to be fair, she has me in the house, so I can guide her.
Yeah, it's probably something that I'll.
But you can. There's lots of resources online.
I mean, the one thing that really works, from what I've seen of the reviews of it, that makes me a little bit more interested in it is that, whereas the other FromSoft games, and this was one of their strengths, but one thing that makes it harder for me is that they are very structured, and that you go and you follow the path, and it's got planned and very well constructed planned encounters and stuff, but that maintains that difficulty level throughout. Whereas with a more open world game, and this fits my needs or my interests more, I love the exploration side of things. I love finding those little nooks and crannies, so that works. And also, if you run into this is the most dense open world game I have ever played. Yeah,
I
and
will tell you that
actually intrigues me and makes me pretty excited. But also the fact that you don't have to bang your head against that boss until you beat it. You can do something else for a while. And I'm a big fan of games that if it's too hard to just beat it when you get to it, you can just grind up a bunch and you can over level yourself, and then everything becomes trivial.
You can over level,
and that means that it's so
many
easy
tools
to
you can
do
use.
that. And I like the description of the variety of gameplay styles. So you can be at a distance or close up and things like that. So it does have a lot of things that are really sort of scratching some of those itches for me. I've still been obsessing over Kenshi, but we'll see if I jump on that. But it's definitely the one that's intrigued me the most of the From Software games. I love reading about them from a game design perspective, but they just never really grabbed me from I want to experience this myself. They're more the types of games that I love watching Let's Plays because I like the aesthetic and I like seeing a skilled person perform in it, but I don't really feel the need to do it myself.
A lot of the systems and things are still, they explain a lot more than in any other previous game, but there's still a lot of oblique and obtuse things that, depending on how much you like either the discovery of it for yourself or looking it up online or, talking with your friends who are playing about it and having that sort of childlike recess interaction of, I found this, I found that, how do you do this, how did you do that kind of thing. But if you get it on PC, you can summon me and I will kill the boss for you. So Trey, if you get it and you're stuck somewhere, just shoot me a message and you can summon me in, and I'll
I guess one of my main frustrations about From Software games is the multiplayer aspect of it. So I'm less interested or less likely to call on others or want people to join my game. I'm very much a hardcore solo play game, except for like party games and stuff like that, or like your Mario Karts and things like that. I do really
that's
enjoy.
The name of your...
But when it comes to something like this, I'm not a team Diablo player or World of Warcraft MMORPG type person.
That's the name of your OnlyFans, Hardcore Solo.
Hardcore Solo. That is definitely it.
All right. Well, we will be back next month, and we're going to be chatting with Chris of Procession Magazine, and we're going to be talking about, Procession Magazine. We're going to be talking about magazines and media and the medium in which we consume and communicate and disperse the culture and the tropes and the language and the fashion and the music of our culture, and the importance of medium and locatedness and esoteric knowledge, and how that relates to a interconnected world and algorithms and all that kind of thing. We're also just going to be talking about music and Chris's journey with music and goth music and the state of goth music. So I think it's going to be fun. I think there's going to be a lot of nostalgia thrown around for the late 90s, 2000s, that kind of thing. And I'm excited to have that chat. So please come back if you would like to get some bonus content, get early access to episodes, join our Discord, see what other kind of stuff you can get, or just support us because you like the kind of content we make and want to further enable us to continue doing that. You can head over to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions and take a look. And of course, as always, a big hearty thank you to everyone who supports us on Patreon, from the bottom of my heart and from the bottom of my ass, which is where goth is stored.
The bottom of your bottom?
Thank you so much. From the bottom of my bottom. So that's it. Until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.